Which is more deadly, 2 atomic bombs or 1 nuclear reactor? In 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. The first detonated over Hiroshima, killing up to 140,000 people. The second exploded above Nagasaki, resulting in the deaths of approximately 70,000 men, women, and children. In 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant suffered a meltdown, leading to an explosion and a fire. Only 30 people died initially at Chernobyl, with an additional 30 dying in the weeks following. So the answer to our original question seems pretty obvious. Why then are Hiroshima and Nagasaki thriving cities, while Chernobyl is little more than an abandoned wasteland? Let's find out. To uncover why millions of people can safely inhabit cities devastated by atomic bombs, while areas around a single nuclear reactor meltdown remain uninhabited, we must delve into the science of radioactive decay, challenge prevailing misconceptions, and examine the critical role of location in nuclear disasters. While all 3 events caused suffering and loss of life, only one resulted in enduring environmental consequences. The subtle differences between the 1945 events in Japan and the 1986 incident in the former Soviet Union had profound implications for the long-term prospects of each region. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ushered in the atomic age by being the first and only nuclear weapons to be used in warfare. The Chernobyl disaster, on the other hand, occurred during the heightened tensions of the Cold War and was not the result of an attack, but negligence and several avoidable mistakes. Today, approximately 1.194 million people live in Hiroshima, 430,000 in Nagasaki, and almost 0 in Chernobyl. However, around 7,000 people, such as scientists, engineers, and safety personnel, still work at the decommissioned power plant and in the surrounding area. Although some of the workers at Chernobyl inhabit the abandoned apartments and buildings near the power plant, they only live there part-time while they're scheduled to work due to dangerous levels of radiation. This is a far cry from the bustling cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where generations of families have made their homes. 3 main factors have led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki being vibrant, bustling cities, while Chernobyl remains a seemingly radioactive wasteland. The first has to do with the location and the altitude. The height at which the bombs detonated versus where the nuclear core melted down played a major role in the amount of radiation in the area. Second, the quantity of fissionable material in each situation differed greatly, especially when it came to Chernobyl. Third, the byproducts produced from each disaster varied due to the timing and the composition of each occurrence. But before we get to the physics and the in-depth analysis of each of these events to understand why Hiroshima and Nagasaki look so different compared to Chernobyl today, we need to go back in time. The way events unfolded in each instance will help us better understand why you can hop on a plane and visit 2 cities in Japan that were nothing more than smoldering rubble less than 80 years ago, but you can't spend any significant amount of time in the desolate Ukrainian town of Chernobyl. On August 6, 1945, at 2:45 a.m., Colonel Paul Tibbets Jr. pushed the throttle of the B-29 superfortress, the Enola Gay, forward. The engines roared to life. The aircraft picked up speed as it raced down the runway. Tibbets pulled back on the flight stick. The plane rose into the air. Its takeoff was a little dicey due to the modifications made to the aircraft, allowing it to deploy its special cargo. Moments later, 2 other B-29s took off from the U.S. airfield on Tinian Island. They would provide the reconnaissance for the Enola Gay to ensure her conditions were adequate to drop the bomb. They would also be used to film the weapon's detonation and document the immediate aftermath. Once the Enola Gay reached cruising altitude, Captain William Parsons began adding the final components to Little Boy. This was not done before takeoff because several modified B-29s had crashed during test flights. A major concern was that if a B-29 crashed with a fully assembled bomb on board, it might detonate and wipe out the entire military base on Tinian Island. This might have served as a demonstration of the destructive power of the atomic bomb, but not in the way the US had hoped for. Therefore, the nuclear device aboard the Enola Gay was not fully assembled until the B-29 was in the air and a safe distance away. After a flight of approximately 1,568 miles, or 2,524 kilometers to Hiroshima, Japan, Colonel Paul Tibbets Jr. relinquished the controls of the Enola Gay to Bombardier Thomas Farabee, who looked through the sighting lens at the city below. Farabee spotted the Ioi Bridge crossing over the Ota River. Before the war, Hiroshima had been the 7th largest city in Japan, with a population of just over 340,000. It governed and served as an economic hub for the country's southwestern region. Once the conflict began, Hiroshima became one of the most important command centers on the island. A major part of the Chugoku Regional Army was stationed there, along with the military supply depots and factories. The city also served as an important shipping point for Japanese soldiers and supplies. The United States had heavily bombed the surrounding area, but the factories were still churning out weapons and vehicles. Colonel Tibbets ordered his crew to put on their protective goggles. Farabee wiped his brow and pushed his face against the sighting apparatus one last time. He spotted his target and dropped the bomb at 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945. The moment the bomb was away, Tibbets banked the B-29 hard in hopes of reaching safety before the atomic blast erupted. A second before the atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima, Little Boy descended to an altitude of 1,900 feet. The gun assembly device fired, and critical mass was achieved when a uranium projectile struck the uranium target within the bomb. This resulted in a chain reaction. Atoms split, neutrons were ripped from their nuclei, creating a massive amount of energy that culminated in an atomic explosion directly over the Shima Hospital in Hiroshima. The moment the bomb detonated, the temperature directly below the blast reached 12,600 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 7,000 degrees Celsius. Everything within the vicinity was immediately incinerated, including people, vehicles, and buildings. The blast wave leveled all structures within the radius, destroying around 2/3 of the city. Out of the 343,000 inhabitants living in Hiroshima, around 70,000 were killed almost instantly. Another 30,000 died within the year from severe burns and radiation poisoning. Milliseconds after detonation, the fireball created by the atomic bomb expanded to 900 feet, or 275 meters above ground zero. The blast wave decimated the city, shattering windows for dozens of miles, and it could be felt up to 37 miles or 60 kilometers away. Fires erupted across Hiroshima as anything flammable ignited from the intense heat. Everything within 4.4 miles or 7 kilometers of the blast's epicenter was incinerated in the raging inferno. This includes schools, churches, hospitals, and homes. The densely packed urban center contained 3/5 of the total population, where the most destruction occurred. The streets of Hiroshima became eerily quiet. The only sounds heard were the crackling of wood burning and structures crumbling. Shadows of people who had been vaporized were cast into the stone of the buildings. These nuclear shadows had appeared when the initial blast bleached everything in the area. Human bodies, lampposts, and anything solid that blocked the brilliant flash of energy and light had protected the structures that they were in front of. The resulting shadows were the stone and concrete's true colors before the atomic bomb detonated. Anything that was not shielded had decades of dirt and filth burnt away from the intense heat of the blast. At Sumitomo Bank, the shadow of a man holding a walking stick was forever cast in the steps, as his body was completely vaporized. 3 minutes after the atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima, the mushroom cloud from the blast rose higher and higher into the air, reaching 40,000 feet above the ground. Less than 1% of the uranium contained within Little Boy achieved fission, yet the destruction was utterly unbelievable. The bomb released the equivalent of more than 15,000 tons of TNT on the city of Hiroshima. Sergeant Bob Karen was the only crew member of the Enola Gay who actually saw the blast, as he was the plane's tail gunner. He described the detonation of Little Boy over Hiroshima as a peep into hell. The co-pilot, Captain Robert Lewis, looked back at the mushroom cloud rising into the sky. "My God, what have we done?" he said. On August 9, 1945, at 3:47 a.m., the boxcar, a B-29 loaded with the Fat Man atomic bomb, took off from Tinian Island and proceeded toward Japan. Major Charles Sweeney was at the controls. The bomb the boxcar carried was more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. It was plutonium-fueled, similar to the bomb detonated during the Trinity test at Alamogordo bombing range. While taking off, Sweeney was particularly careful. Unlike the Little Boy bomb, Fat Man was already completely assembled in his cargo hold. Once the plane was safely in the air, Commander Frederick Ashworth armed the bomb. Again, 2 other B-29s accompanied the boxcar on its mission to aid in sighting the target. At the time of takeoff, clear skies with light haze were reported over the primary target of Kokura. Sweeney piloted the plane toward the destination. At 9:45 a.m., Sweeney reported that he couldn't see anything on the ground. The weather over Kokura had deteriorated. The visibility of the city below was nearly zero. This may have been caused by the firebombing runs conducted on the nearby city of Yahata the night before. Sweeney decided to circle back for another pass. On the second time around, the city below was still covered by haze and clouds. There was no telling where the target was and when to drop the bomb. "Can anyone see anything?" Sweeney shouted as he circled back for one more pass, but everyone reported back negative. Sweeney checked the fuel gauge. They'd been circling above Kokura for nearly 45 minutes. The clouds had not cleared. Time was slowly slipping away. Sweeney decided to give up on their primary objective and move to the secondary target of Nagasaki. At 10:58 a.m., 4 minutes before the second atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, the city of Nagasaki was obscured from view by more clouds. Captain Kermit Behan was a bombardier on the mission and looked through the scope to try to locate the Mitsubishi arms plant. The structure was supposed to be their target in Nagasaki. Moments before Sweeney was going to call off the mission, a clearing in the clouds appeared in the city's northern section. It was not their pre-planned target, but it was close enough that the bomb would take out the arms plant in the blast. At 11:02 a.m., the Fat Man atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The nuclear device fell to an altitude of 1,650 feet. The detonation mechanism triggered. The subcritical plutonium core was surrounded by several thousand pounds of explosives. They were arranged in a way that when they fired, the explosive forces were directed inward toward the plutonium core. The force of the explosion crushed the plutonium into a supercritical state, and a nuclear chain reaction commenced. This type of atomic bomb created a much bigger explosion than Little Boy. Fat Man went off with a force of 21,000 tons of TNT. 40,000 people were instantly vaporized, and another 30,000 would die in the aftermath from radiation poisoning. 40% of the city's buildings were destroyed. As the mushroom cloud erupted into the air, the shockwave struck the boxcar, rattling the plane's hull. Sweeney regained control and steered the craft further away from the spreading debris cloud. Something to note before we briefly examine what happened at the Chernobyl power plant is that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki both occurred high above the cities and only lasted for seconds. The fires, the fallout, and the destruction that ensued after the bombs detonated lasted for days, weeks, and months after each event. However, the release of energy and radiation from the bombs themselves was over fairly quickly. The same cannot be said about the Chernobyl disaster. In 1977, Soviet engineers and workers constructed 4 RBMK nuclear reactors at the site, which would become the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant, just south of the Belarus border in Ukraine, about 65 miles or 104 kilometers north of Kyiv. After the disaster, this facility would simply be known as Chernobyl. By the following year, one of the reactors would be brought online, and in 1984 the plant would have 4 active reactors with a 5th under construction. Each of the reactors was capable of producing around 1,000 megawatts of electric power. On April 25, 1986 at 1 in the morning, the operators at Chernobyl reduced the power being sent to reactor number 4 as they prepared to run a safety test on the system. This was done at the same time that routine maintenance was being carried out. The test itself would determine if the still spinning turbines of the reactor could continue to produce enough electricity to keep the coolant pumps operating if there was ever a complete loss of power at the plant. They needed the data to surmise whether the gap between a power loss and the time it took for the emergency generators to kick in would result in a nuclear meltdown or a catastrophic failure. As the sun rose, the tests were put on hold since the energy demands on the power plant would be highest during the day when the inhabitants of the surrounding areas were awake. At 11:10 p.m., operators at Chernobyl received word that they could continue the test. However, the shift change was just about to happen, so rather than starting the test and switching operators, the shutdown was again delayed. At midnight, the new shift came in. Just after midnight, the workers were informed that the experiment was to commence once again. The power output of reactor number 4 was lowered to 720 megawatts. The reactor was not designed to go below 700 megawatts for a sustained period of time, but for some reason, most likely due to poor oversight and training, the night shift operators at Chernobyl were unaware of the safety measure. At 12:28 a.m. on April 26th, the reactor reached 500 megawatts. The local control system switched over to the automatic regulating system as energy output became dangerously low. In order to remedy the situation, the operators scrambled to remove many of the control rods in the reactor, which directly violated the safety guidelines at the power plant. This decision did not have the desired effect. A buildup of xenon on the core caused the power levels to drop even further. Either due to human error or a malfunction in the system, the reactor's output fell to 30 megawatts. By 1 a.m., the team had managed to raise the power output of reactor number 4 to 200 megawatts. This was still below prescribed levels, but it seemed the core had stabilized for the moment. The deputy chief engineer and acting supervisor at Chernobyl, Anatoly Stepanovich Dyatlov, decided that the test could resume. In preparation for what was to come, he ordered the automatic emergency shutdown system and power regulating system to be turned off. Water flow was increased to the core, while additional cooling pumps were activated. This decreased the heat in the system and led to low reactivity, necessitating the need to remove more control rods so the reactor could continue to run at 7% power for the next several minutes. At 1:23:04 a.m., reactor number 4 began to run as planned. However, at 1:23:40 a.m., pressure began to build in the core. A series of warning lights started to flash. One of the operators initiated an emergency shutdown, but several control rods jammed as they entered the core. An out-of-control chain reaction began to occur in the reactor. At 1:23:58 a.m. on April 26, 1986, the chain reaction reached critical levels, and there was an explosion in reactor number 4. This was immediately followed by a second explosion that blew the 1,000-ton lid off the reactor and shot a radioactive fireball into the sky, briefly illuminating the surrounding area as if it were the middle of the day. The explosion in reactor number 4 caused a massive disruption in energy output. Power fluctuated throughout the plant. The explosion ejected hundreds of tons of irradiated dust into the air as chunks of radioactive graphite hurtled across the surrounding landscape. Radiation began to spew out of the exposed reactor like smoke rising from a volcano. At least 28 people were killed in the initial explosion, and 100 more were seriously injured out of the 600 workers present at the plant that night. 134, including the operators running the test gone wrong, received between 0.8 and 16 grays of radiation, or about 80 to 1,600 rads. This high dose of radiation resulted in all of them developing symptoms of radiation poisoning soon after the accident. 28 died within 3 months of the reactor exploding. Nuclear engineers and scientists from across the Soviet Union who were consulted about the Chernobyl disaster warned the leadership that as long as the core was exposed and the fire within it continued to burn, more and more radioactive material would be spewed into the air and swept across the region. At 10 a.m. on April 27th, the Soviets began flying transport helicopters loaded with sand, boron, lead, and dolomite over the exposed core of reactor number 4. These substances were dropped into the hole to suppress the fire and contain some of the radiation. At this point, the radioactive particles had been spewing out of the reactor for over 24 hours. On April 29th, U.S. spy satellites confirmed the damage sustained by the Chernobyl power plant was much worse than the Soviets were letting on. Reactor number 4 was completely exposed, and around 30% of the power plant's 190 metric tons of uranium had been ejected into the atmosphere. If the Soviets didn't get the reactor fire under control and contain the radiation leak soon, neighboring nations might be facing a radioactive crisis soon. On May 4th, a new set of containment crews started to work at Chernobyl and began pumping liquid nitrogen underneath the reactor to cool it down. A total of 800,000 people, referred to as liquidators, were involved in the arduous job of containment and cleanup around the power plant. They needed to remove any debris blown off the structure as the initial explosions ripped through the facility. Entire villages near the power plant were bulldozed, and any animals present in the exclusion zone were shot on sight. Any radioactive rubble or waste was buried deep underground, including the topsoil layer. Then, on May 6, the radioactive emissions being discharged from reactor number 4 decreased dramatically. This was most likely due to the fire in the core finally burning itself out. However, this meant that radioactive emissions were released from the exposed core for 10 straight days. Let's take a deeper dive into the main differences between these events, explaining why Hiroshima and Nagasaki are thriving, while Chernobyl is still uninhabitable. Reason 1. Height and location. Both of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki detonated well above ground level. The failed reactor at Chernobyl, on the other hand, was obviously not floating in the air when it melted down. This fundamental difference in altitude helps explain why the locations in Japan are so vastly different than those in Chernobyl. The atomic bombs that exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki were detonated at specific altitudes to maximize the explosion's yield and power. Even if United States military scientists knew about the long-term effects of radiation caused by a nuclear explosion at the time, they would have likely made the same decision of detonating the bombs well above the cities. The reason for this is that the US was not trying to turn Hiroshima and Nagasaki into radioactive wastelands, but it was trying to create as much immediate damage as possible to shock the Japanese leadership into surrendering. The bombs were never meant to be precise or accurate, but instead to decimate the enemy with a single blast. Interestingly, the explosion at Chernobyl was much smaller than those of the bombs dropped on Japan. It's estimated that the explosion at Chernobyl was the equivalent of approximately 225 tons of TNT. Conversely, Little Boy detonated with around 15,000 tons of TNT power and Fat Man with 21,000 tons. However, even though the explosion at Chernobyl was a fraction of the size of the atomic bombs, it released nearly 400 times as much radioactive material into the atmosphere, along with huge chunks of radioactive debris that were strewn across the landscape. There are 4 types of nuclear blasts, each corresponding to a different height in relation to the ground. The first is a high-altitude burst, which typically occurs when a nuclear explosion occurs 100,000 feet above the ground. In this situation, there's actually little fallout compared to other nuclear explosions, because no debris is kicked up to which radioactive particles can attach themselves. Instead, high-altitude bursts generate large electromagnetic pulses, or EMPs, that can render electronics on the ground or satellites in low Earth orbit inoperable. However, it's worth mentioning that all types of nuclear blasts have this effect. The second category of nuclear blast is the air burst. This is what the atomic bombs dropped on Japan were. Typically, these explosions occur well below 100,000 feet, but still over 1,000 feet above the ground. For example, Little Boy at Hiroshima detonated at an altitude of 1,900 feet, or 579 meters. Fat Man exploded at around 1,650 feet, or 503 meters. This results in the initial blast accelerating towards the ground, resulting in the energy from the explosion being reflected and dispersed outward along the landscape. This outward energy dispersal is similar to when a glass bowl is dropped on a hard surface and the shards radiate outward from the impact site. However, when a nuclear blast is reflected and dispersed outward, it creates superheated, high-powered winds that destroy everything in its path. An airburst tends to kick up some debris into the atmosphere, but not as much as the next type of nuclear blast. This means that the fallout of an air blast is not as long-lasting or as dangerous as what we'll discuss next. The third type of nuclear blast is a surface burst. This is where there's a nuclear explosion at ground level. To be fair, Chernobyl was not a nuclear explosion, but an explosion that occurred due to a runaway chain reaction in a power plant's nuclear core. So this means there was no mushroom cloud or devastating shockwave. However, a huge amount of radioactive material kicked up into the air and spread throughout the region. This is typical of surface blasts because, unlike a high-altitude or air burst, the explosion happens close to the ground, where dirt, dust, and other particles can be ejected into the sky and fall back to Earth hundreds of feet or miles away. The fact that the Chernobyl disaster happened at ground level instead of thousands of feet in the air is one of the main reasons that the surrounding area has remained irradiated for so long. The last type of nuclear blast is the subsurface blast, which occurs below ground. Depending on the depth, this type of explosion can generate huge amounts of radioactive debris if it breaks the surface. However, there's little data on the effects of a subsurface blast, as this type of nuclear explosion has rarely been carried out. Some scientists estimate that around 90% of the radiation generated by the atomic bombs dropped on Japan was pulled up into the atmosphere and never made it to the ground. Unfortunately, since the Chernobyl disaster occurred at ground level, much more of the radiation generated by the exposed core ended up settling in the area around the power plant. However, a large amount also still ended up in the atmosphere and floated over Europe, which was how Sweden and eventually the rest of the world found out about the incident at the Soviet Union power plant in the first place. Reason 2. Quantity and time. Nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors are two very different things. The goal of an atomic bomb is to release as much energy as possible in a short amount of time. This is done by splitting atoms, almost instantly releasing an abundance of energy. In Little Boy, uranium-235 was used to create a nuclear explosion, while Fat Man contained plutonium-239. The Chernobyl power plant also used uranium-235, but in a very different way. In an atomic bomb such as Little Boy, a relatively small amount of uranium is needed to create a nuclear explosion. 2.2 pounds or 1 kilogram of U-235 can release the energy equivalent of about 17 kilotons of TNT. Little Boy contained 141 pounds or 64 kilograms of uranium, 80% of which was U-235. However, less than 0.001 kilograms of the uranium was converted directly into energy. The rest was particleized and either swept away by the atmosphere's winds or fell to the ground. When we examine the amount of fissionable material used at Chernobyl, a stark difference becomes quickly apparent. A 1,000 megawatt reactor like that at the Chernobyl power plant requires around 50,000 pounds of enriched uranium per year and produces 54,000 pounds of waste. At the time of the meltdown, Reactor 4 was estimated to have contained just over 4,000 pounds of uranium in its core. When comparing the 141 pounds of uranium-235 contained in Little Boy to the 4,000 pounds of the same substance in the Chernobyl reactor, it becomes clear why so much more radiation was released in the power plant disaster. The other key difference is the amount of time that the uranium was releasing radiation. When the atomic bombs exploded, all the uranium and plutonium were used up almost instantly. However, when the reactor core melted down at Chernobyl, the fuel rods containing U-235 continued to release radiation for 10 days straight. The amount of material in the core and the length of time that it spewed radiation are two major reasons why Chernobyl is still radioactive and devoid of any major human populations today. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on the other hand, endured a massive atomic blast that released a huge amount of energy over a short period of time. This caused massive immediate damage, but reduced the long-term impact on those areas. Reason 3. Byproducts. We now need to get into the science of radiation and what is known as half-life to fully understand the differences between Hiroshima and Nagasaki versus Chernobyl. When talking about radioactivity, a half-life refers to the time it takes for a substance to decay into half its initial quantity. For example, if you had 1 pound of plutonium-239, the half-life would be how long it took for the sample to decay into uranium-235, a much more stable substance. The answer for this particular element is 24,000 years. The starting amount of the radioactive material is arbitrary, since the half-life is specific to the substance, not the quantity. As a rule of thumb, the shorter the half-life of a radioactive substance, the more dangerous it is. Therefore, although plutonium-239 emits some radiation, it's not enough to cause serious illness unless huge quantities are ingested or small particles find their way into someone's lungs. However, a substance like iodine-131 has a half-life of only 8 days, which means it decays rapidly and releases a tremendous amount of radiation while doing so. Another highly radioactive element is cesium-137, which has a half-life of 30 years. However, many experts agree that it's only safe to be around areas affected by cesium-137 approximately 300 years after exposure. But how do all of these elements and numbers connect back to Chernobyl and the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? At Chernobyl, the radioactive materials that were released from the destroyed reactor were mainly iodine-131, cesium-134, and cesium-137. It was determined that iodine-131 in particular was extremely lethal. It could easily get into the human body through breathing contaminated air, consumption of leafy greens, or ingesting dairy products. If consumed this way, the iodine would build up in the thyroid gland. This posed a significant risk to infants and children ingesting large amounts of milk and dairy. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation conducted a research study that concluded more than 6,000 children and adolescents developed thyroid cancer as a direct result of the Chernobyl disaster. Some have disputed this, but there's no denying the fact that young children are much more vulnerable to radiation due to their diet and physiology. Hiroshima and Nagasaki also had to contend with some of these more deadly radioactive elements. The difference is that there was just a lot less material in the atomic bombs that could be converted into these more radioactive elements than in the Chernobyl reactor core. Both Little Boy and Fat Man released their energy within seconds, and that was it. Some radioactive particles fell to Earth or attached themselves to dust and debris, but many others drifted away and stayed in the atmosphere or fell into the ocean. The uranium-235 and plutonium-239 that remained after the blast have half-lives of 700 million years and 24,000 years respectively, meaning they emit very low levels of radiation. In fact, both Hiroshima and Nagasaki currently have the same levels of radiation as everywhere else on the planet that has never been affected by a nuclear catastrophe. Let's be clear about what we've just discussed. We're not saying that the effects of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not comparable to what happened at Chernobyl. In fact, the opposite argument could easily be made. Over 200,000 people died as a direct result of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945, compared to the 60 or so people who died at Chernobyl. Any number of lives lost is a tragedy. Still, when we compare sheer numbers, there is no other nuclear incident in history that can compare to the death and destruction caused in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the atomic bombs dropped by the United States. There were and still are long-lasting effects of the atomic bombs in Japan, but due to a lack of understanding of how radiation exposure could affect the human body at the time, rebuilding the cities began almost immediately after the end of World War II. This lack of fear over radiation and its effects allowed the cities to grow rapidly, where they may not have given today's knowledge. At Chernobyl, parts of the exclusion zone are habitable even now, especially on the outskirts of the region. but the fear of being near the power plant is ever present in the minds of the Ukrainians and people worldwide. Chernobyl remains a barren landscape devoid of human settlements because of the amount of radioactive material present in the exposed core and the length of time that the reactor continuously spewed out radiation. However, it's also because of the fear that resulted in a nuclear meltdown during the Cold War. This is why Hiroshima and Nagasaki don't resemble Chernobyl today. Now watch, what if the USA launched a nuclear bomb minute by minute? Or check out Russia's nuke targets.